let's just talk about the process first of all. You voted for 13 out of 15 candidates. First of all, why?
Because there were 13 candidates that met my standard for what was necessary for a legislative council member at the first round. The system is different now. You can plump for 0, 1 or 2, 3, 4, 5 candidates, or you can do what we intended, which is just to say yes or no at each stage of the vote for the candidate. The speakers explained that very clearly yesterday on your programme.
But 13, vote for somebody, vote for nobody. I mean, it makes a mockery of the process, really, doesn't it?
The Standing Orders Committee of the House of Keys considered this last spring, and the primary objective, as I heard it, was that they wanted the election to be completed in one day.
But at the expense of ability candidates, of making a mockery of a system. You shouldn't vote for any more candidates than there are seats.
Well, that's how it is in a general election, but a voting system has to suit the question and the election that's in the question, and there's really no need to have the same voting system across the piece in different situations. So, as I say, an important point in March for many people was that Legislative Council looked silly when it went on for 15 weeks, the election. So this time it actually took fewer minutes than it took weeks in the past on some occasions.
This previous system had flaws, but this system has got flaws too, hasn't it? I mean, I'm not saying it's not an improvement. And incidentally, you were far from the only one. I think Jim Watterson voted for 11, Alex Allenson for 9, Geoffrey Boot, Alfred Cannon 8, Martin Perkins, Daphne Kane, Ray Harmer, David Ashford 7. But shouldn't it be one man or one woman, one vote?
Well, the Standing Orders Committee is meeting again in 2 or 3 weeks' time, and we will revisit the election system and see whether or not we'll recommend to the House of Keys changing it. But I just want to go back to the point. We certainly got different candidates elected. Previously, in former decades, the average age has been over 60. People have had 10 years of experience in the House of Keys. We had a sort of aldermanic bench, elder statesman type feel to the Legislative Council. The Legislative Council in that form, though, is only decades old. It's not centuries old. The Legislative Council is evolving. We are at a critical moment in that evolution. In evolution, at some point, you come out of the water and start walking. At another point, you decide to start talking intelligibly rather than, and so on. And I think the Legislative Council is at that stage. It's very much at a crucial stage in its evolution, and what happens next is going to be critical.
But do you think this system, though, this voting system, while, the efficiency can't be argued, there's a lot of plaudits for it, but in terms of MHKs voting for 9, 11, 13 candidates, that's against the principles, isn't it?
Well, we'll work it out inside the House of Keys. It might well be. It certainly surprised and shocked people and got them focusing on the voting system. But as I say, it worked, I think, as intended by a number of people. The basic point to understand my 13 votes is I had quite a low threshold for the person who needed to be an MLC. I described how they used to be, and I've been campaigning for 4 or 5 years to end 4 decades of trying to make the Legislative Council directly elected, except if it's in a unicameral system as a legislative committee, because ultimately I don't think that can ever work. There have been many clever politicians over the last 4 decades who've tried to make that work and they've failed. So what I'm now saying is if we can't have a directly elected second chamber, what we've got to have is a fundamentally reduced power second chamber, and consequently it's great to have a diverse set of MLCs, and I'm fascinated to see what each of them does next. Jane Paul Wilson took a particular decision not to join a department. The other 4 members who used to be in the Legislative Council were in departments, and each of the 4 new members has now got to decide how they react. Jane Paul Wilson has pioneered a way. She was one of only 3 people in current Tynwald, me and Chris Robertshaw being the other 2, who didn't immediately jump into a departmental member job, and I think that's one of the reasons why she got practically every vote in the House of Keys, because there's a lot of respect for what she's done to actually pioneer a new way of being an MLC.
Jane Paul Wilson was considered largely the outstanding candidate, of course, but there were other candidates of great ability who were overlooked.
Yeah, and that's my point. That's why I'm justifying my votes for 13, because there was in one sense, there was a great range of candidates who didn't have that much between them. So, for instance, the people who came 6th and 7th are already serving on important government public boards. So, Mr. Cartledge is a colleague of mine on the Public Service Commission. Shirley Corlett is being nominated for the Communications Commission at this coming Tynwald. So there were candidates all the way through. I thought Christine Wheeler's case was interesting. I I thought that Alistair Ramsey made a good pitch for a different way of doing politics. I thought many of the other candidates had. I think Joan Kelly had an interesting idea, and he's obviously associated with direct democracy.
Well, let's pause there for a moment, actually, because I want to listen to the views of one of the unsuccessful candidates, retired tax and commercial consultant Christine Wheeler, about the process.
It was probably a bit quicker than anyone thought. I think most people thought it might go to a second round, but maybe not further than that with the new voting procedure. But it was incredibly quick, and it because it had none of the pomp and circumstance. There was no presentation of the candidates. It was even shorter than you might think. It just went incredibly quickly.
It's a women takeover now in the Legislative Council.
Yeah, that is really interesting, because I worked out a few days ago whom I thought would probably be elected. And the one thing I decided on was that the House of Keys would never agree.
All five women?
With all five. I just couldn't believe that it could get that kind of majority support. But of course, the way the voting goes...
was that a democratic system to you?
I didn't disagree with the way the voting was done. I think as time goes on, the MHKs will get to understand more how voting a very few numbers for some people actually means you're always going to get people elected in one round. No, I didn't. I thought perhaps the only part that I thought was undemocratic was the fact there really isn't any time, even within the hustings, which, as you know, I unfortunately missed, to debate. You don't get a chance to actually talk about subjects that you're interested in, the things you really care about, and be challenged on them.
That has been and gone now. You obviously weren't your expectations weren't high, I think it's fair to say, because obviously you weren't at the hustings as well, and you were a late declaration, if you like. What have you taken personally out of this brief campaign?
Not to do it again.
Is that right? Yeah.
I just don't think the process is a process that you can engage with unless you're given the opportunity to talk about all the things you care about, rather than... I actually thought the media interviews were good. I'm not suggesting they weren't. But because you, as an interviewer, you're trying to compare one candidate with another, the questions are going to be the same. And they're aimed at the same sorts of things. Well, of course, the candidates are very different. And also, for instance, if you care a lot about process, as I do with scrutiny, the humanity in you doesn't come out at all. What charities you support, the things you care about that are social problems. And similarly, if you're very much geared to the social side, you don't get to talk so much about the bigger policy issues. And I think that's important in democracy.
A free-for-all?
I don't know if it's a free-for-all or who you know. I mean, it was just a very different process to anything I thought about.
Mrs. Wheeler there. Well, tell me, she agreed about the voting system, as you did, but not about the process of engagement. So, I mean, you proposed, Mrs. Wheeler. Was there enough chance for debate? Did the process play for or against the strengths that you clearly saw in her?
Yeah, no, Mrs. Wheeler was a very reluctant candidate, but she corresponds furiously with a great number of people in Tynwald, and she made a very good point. Lord Lisfane suggested a nomination process. I suggested to Lord Lisfane the process of getting endorsements from people outside Tynwald to be on the ballot paper. It was Alf and I who moved the amendment that we'd lead at least 4 people in the nomination process rather than 2 as it had been previously. I think that's one thing that we'll look at. And again, Christine made another very good point, which is that when you have a large number of candidates and a small number of voters, we're probably looking at an alternative voting system rather than this sort of getting 13 and everybody having lots of votes. So that's another thing that I want to put on the table of the Standing Orders Committee that's coming up.
It was suggested to me that some of the senior servants will be rubbing their hands with glee now, because there are a number of candidates who will be literally starting from a blank canvas and won't be able to hit the ground running.
Or it might be the opposite way, because we've got 5 people who desperately want to prove themselves, so they'll be taking up every issue that people have taken up in the past just to be doing something, and they'll be looking to move amendments to legislation. So I don't know how it will play out, but I would strongly recommend the Jane Poole Wilson approach, which is to think very much before you start your MLC process what you believe the future of the Legislative Council should be. And I do hope that this can be a transition process, a period of evolution.
That suggests to me that you're laying down the gauntlet to the likes likes of Marlene Hendy, Tanya Humbles, dare I say it, I think some of her colleagues up here had Humbles pie after that result. Kerry Sharp.
You'd have been a great MLC, James.
Well, enough of that. Tell me, though, diversity is sold as change.
Yeah.
But in reality, nothing's changing overnight, is it?
Nothing's changing overnight, but last spring we had a flurry of activity in the Key Standing Order Committee. We came up with a committee of the whole House to help me with the Equality Bill, and that's been transformational. It's made the House of Keys more like the Legislative Council used to be in the past, and we're now the people who are doing the amending in the legislation. We came up with a media code. We came up with this process for electing the Legislative Council. At the next committee, we've not only got all of those issues to review, we've also got the organisation of the Chief Minister elections, because there's certain things in law in the Isle of Man, for instance, the number of MLCs, the way that the Chief Minister ultimately is elected, but underpinning that are the standing orders. And this, at the next meeting, we've not only got to review the Legislative Council process, we've got to review the process that will be used in 2021 for the next Chief Minister election. And there's a lot of importance in that committee. Obviously, the decision will be made by the whole House of Keys, but that committee, comprising the Speaker, myself, Ray Harmer, Graham Cragine, Laurie Hooper and David Ashford, has been very important
All
in
men.
carrying on this evolution. And yeah, fair point, fair comment.
Well, no, actually, I don't know if you heard before, but the recent gender report produced by the Chamber of Commerce, now since Monday, the percentage of women in Tynwald has gone up to 30.3%. That's now 1% ahead of the UK. So
There you go.
you could say that imbalance has
And
been...
our gender pay gap is lower than
well-
the UK on the median of wages, and we've got an Equality Act out there. And what you and I have both got to remember, James, as a public service broadcaster and as a politician, is the issues that really matter are health, education, the economy, pensions, funding of residential and nursing care. But to get those right, we need a good governance system, and that's our excuse for talking so much about how Tynwald works.
We are talking so much, and I'd love to carry on because there's so much to explore, but we are out of time.